In an elegant hospital, a billionaire arrives accompanied by his mistress, treating everything as just another detail in his impeccable routine, until an emergency breaks the silence and changes everything. In the cold corridors, he comes across a scene that makes his past resurface in a brutal way, forcing him to face decisions he believed were already buried. Between guilt, pride, and truths never told, what seemed resolved reveals itself to be only the beginning of a much larger emotional collapse. And when everything begins to crumble at the same time, he realizes that there are battles that cannot be won with power, money, or influence. Before discovering how this intense story unfolds, don't forget to subscribe for more reports full of twists and deep emotions. The lobby of Hospital San Joaquim had that particular smell that Renato Cavalcanti could never ignore. Antiseptic, mixed with old coffee and excessive air conditioning. He entered through the revolving door with the ease of someone who enters anywhere, slightly ahead without haste, as if the environment would adjust to his presence and not the other way around. Behind him, Isabella held her bag with both hands and looked around with that expression of someone trying to look discreet without succeeding. Renato Cavalcanti was 52 years old, with broad shoulders, closely cropped grey hair, and the kind of posture built not in the gym, but over decades of meetings where it was always he who closed the matter. Founder of Cavalcanti Incorporações, one of the largest real estate groups in the São Paulo-Campinas axis, he was used to environments organizing themselves around his schedule. The hospital was no exception. He had scheduled Isabella's appointment 3 weeks in advance, confirmed it the day before, and told his secretary he would need to leave by 11:30. Isabella was 31 years old and had a rising career in the corporate events sector. They had been together for almost 8 months, long enough for her to know that he preferred silence to small talk, and that punctuality, for Renato, was a moral issue. She didn't complain. There was something about him that still fascinated her, that absolute certainty with which he occupied any space. The receptionist confirmed her name in the system and pointed to the corridor on the left. Renato stayed in the lobby. There was no reason to go in together. It was a routine consultation. He had made that clear in the car. He positioned himself near the glass wall that overlooked the internal garden, checked his phone, answered 2 emails, and began to reread a legal opinion his lawyer had sent the previous morning. São Joaquim was a medium-sized private hospital in Jardins, known for providing good service without flaunting. Renato had a preference for places like this, efficient, discreet, without the exhibitionism of the large hospital complexes on Paulista. He knew the clinical director by sight. They had been introduced at some charity dinner about 3 years ago. This also mattered to him, knowing the right people in the right places, even from a distance. It was perhaps 15 minutes. He had put away his phone and was distractedly observing the movement in the lobby when he heard the sound of the side doors opening with more urgency than usual. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the kind of movement that stands out precisely because of its contrast with the lukewarm rhythm of the place. Fast steps, a low voice giving instructions, the slight creak of wheels on laminate flooring. The stretcher entered through the side corridor and was led toward the stabilization wing. Renato saw it at a glance without intending to see, but something made his gaze not detach immediately. The woman on the stretcher was on her side, her face partially covered by the oxygen mask, her dark hair spread over the thin pillow. She was wearing a beige cotton blouse that he recognized before recognizing her face, because there was a specific way she folded the collar that he had seen hundreds of times. Then came the face, pale, eyes closed, eyebrows slightly contracted, as if she were trying to concentrate on something that hurt. Marina. He didn't say the name out loud. He didn't say anything. He stood still with his phone in his hand and felt something he didn't quite recognize. It wasn't exactly shock. It wasn't exactly pain. It was more like the moment the ground disappears beneath your feet before the body registers the fall. Marina Caldas, his ex-wife. They had signed the divorce 6 months earlier, after almost 12 years of marriage. The separation had been his initiative, conducted with efficiency, without major public scenes, as he preferred. He had transferred the Higienopolis apartment to her, guaranteed a fair financial transfer according to the property agreement, and moved on. That was what he told himself, that he had moved on. What he was not prepared to see was the volume under the hospital sheet. Marina was pregnant, visibly pregnant, and she was being rushed along by a team that clearly had no time for pauses. Renato took 2 steps toward the corridor before a nurse raised a hand firmly. Restricted area. He stopped. He stood looking at the doors that closed behind the stretcher, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do with his own hands. Renato stood still in the corridor for a time he couldn't measure. Around him, the hospital continued at its pace, people passing, someone talking low on the phone near the reception, the distant clinking of equipment. Everything went on as if nothing had happened, because for the rest of the world nothing had happened. Only for him did the air seem to have changed consistency. Isabella returned from the medical corridor with a paper in her hand and a slightly relieved expression, as happens after routine consultations that confirm everything is fine. She saw him standing there and frowned. He went to her before she opened her mouth. He said he needed to check something, that it would take a few minutes, that she could wait in the reception or order a coffee on the ground floor. He said all this in such a uniform tone that Isabella only nodded without asking anything. That was the dynamic between them. He decided the pace, she adjusted. She had learned this quickly, and there was a part of her that wondered sometimes if this learning made her smarter or just more of an accomplice. Renato went to the reception and asked to speak with someone from the service team. The attendant, a woman with long nails and a professional smile, heard the name he provided and consulted the system. Then she looked up with that expression, trained not to reveal anything. She could not provide information about patients except to direct family members or registered legal guardians. The protocol was clear. He didn't press. Renato Cavalcanti rarely pressed directly. That was what people who didn't know how to calculate the right moment did. Instead, he thanked her with precise politeness, went back to the corridor, and stood near the glass wall as before. But now the legal opinion on his phone remained closed. He was looking at the garden without seeing the garden. What disturbed him was not just the shock of having seen Marina in that state. It was what the vision had unlocked. A series of questions he had refused to formulate in recent months, because formulating questions about her contradicted the narrative he had constructed so carefully. The narrative was simple. The marriage had exhausted its cycle. 12 years were enough for any cycle. Marina was a good person. He had said this to friends, to the lawyer, even to her brother in the only phone call they had after the announcement of the separation. A good person with whom he had shared an important phase of life, but he had reached a point where he needed something different, a presence that stimulated instead of accommodated. He had described Marina as settled several times in various conversations, until the word had naturally stuck to her in his mental vocabulary. But settled was not the word that came to mind now. The woman he had seen on the stretcher was pregnant, alone, without any companion he could identify, being rushed by a medical team. And she had decided to go through an entire pregnancy without him knowing of its existence. This was not the posture of a settled person. It was the posture of someone who had made a difficult decision and was honoring it in silence. There was something else he couldn't push away, the pregnancy. When they separated, Marina was 40 years old. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't simple either. And if there was a pregnancy in progress when they separated, or shortly after, then there were things he had left behind without knowing what he was leaving. An hour and 20 minutes after entering the hospital, Renato left through the same lobby where he had arrived. Isabella walked by his side. He had said only that he had recognized someone and needed to confirm some data, and she had dropped the subject with the skill of someone who knows when not to insist. In the car, he typed the office address into the dashboard and remained silent during the entire trip through Paulista. In the afternoon of that day, he tried to work. He signed 3 contracts, approved a blueprint, and rejected a partnership proposal he had been inclined to accept the previous week. But between one thing and another, when the silence of the office became too heavy, the image returned. Marina on her side on the stretcher, her eyebrow contracted, the unmistakable volume under the sheet. He called her brother at 6 in the evening, not to get information. He knew Ricardo wouldn't tell him anything Marina didn't want him to know. He called because he needed some anchor in the real world, some confirmation that it had actually happened. Ricardo answered after 4 rings and was silent for a moment when Renato said he had seen Marina at the hospital. Ricardo's silence said more than any answer would have. Renato hung up the phone, stood looking at the 12th floor window with the view of the city lighting up in the late afternoon, and understood that there would be things he would have to learn to carry without anyone naming them for him. In the following 3 days, Renato Cavalcanti maintained his schedule with a discipline that he himself recognized as defensive. Meetings, visits to construction sites, lunch with investors at Fasano, a dinner that Isabella organized at her apartment in Moema with 2 couple friends. He was present in all of this in the same way he was present at the hospital, physically, but with some part of himself held back in a laminate-floored corridor in front of doors that did not open for him. On the 4th night, when Isabella fell asleep, he got up, went to the balcony, and stood looking at the neighborhood below. Moema had that silence of a residential area that he had never appreciated, but that night it seemed appropriate for his vigil. He had known Marina for almost 16 years. They had met at an architecture fair when he was still a minority partner in the company he would later buy entirely. She worked in the interior design sector of a partner office, and there was a specific way she looked at blueprints and models, as if she were looking for what was missing, not what was there. He had noticed that before noticing anything else about her. The marriage had been good for many years. He was not fool enough to deny that. They had built things together, shared difficult decisions, crossed market crises, and personal moments that didn't fit into any annual report. Marina had stepped away from the partner office in the first years to take care of the marriage, then had set up a small design consultancy business of her own that worked well without being grandiose. He had never completely understood why she didn't want to expand. He had interpreted that as a lack of ambition. Now, in the silence of Isabella's balcony, he thought that perhaps Marina simply knew what she wanted, and that the problem had been his inability to see value in what didn't scale. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual and asked his assistant, Claudia, to check some information discreetly. Not about Marina. He hadn't reached that point yet, or didn't want to admit he had reached it. He asked for information about service protocols at San Joaquim and about how the registration of legal guardians worked in cases of hospitalization. Claudia, who had worked with him for 9 years and had developed an almost clinical ability not to ask anything beyond what was necessary, said she would check and send it in writing later that morning. The report arrived at noon. It was short, precise. In cases of hospitalization without a registered spouse or immediate relative, the hospital followed the standard protocol of contacting the list of guardians provided by the patient at the moment of admission. Without this formal link, no information could be shared with third parties, regardless of the previous relationship they claimed to have. Renato reread the paragraph twice. Legally, he was already nothing to her. This phrase had sounded bureaucratic when the lawyer used it during the process. Now it sounded another way, like a sentence he himself had signed with full consciousness, without imagining the concrete forms it would take. That afternoon he did something he hadn't done for at least 2 years. He went personally to the Higienopolis apartment. Not to enter. He had transferred the property to Marina in the agreement and no longer had any legal justification to be there. But he went to the street, parked the car half a block away, and stood looking at the building from the outside, as if the facade could tell him something the hospital protocols refused. The doorman he knew had been replaced by a younger one who didn't recognize him. The intercom remained silent. There was no answer at the apartment. When he returned to the car, he found a message from Isabella about the weekend. She had managed to get a reservation at a hotel in Campos de Jordão, 2 days. She had really liked their last trip. He stood looking at the message for longer than necessary before responding with a great and putting away his phone. The night that followed was the first in which he could not sleep at all. He lay in his own apartment. He had returned to his in Consolação with a justification that Isabella had accepted without contesting, and mentally reviewed the last year of the marriage with an honesty he had avoided during all the months since then. There were signs he had ignored. Marina calling sometimes in the middle of the day for no apparent reason, and him diverting to voicemail because he was in a meeting or because he simply didn't want to interrupt what he was doing. Her proposing dinners out in a tone that he had read as an attempt to maintain a routine, and that now began to seem like something else. Attempts at connection that he had made increasingly difficult to establish. There was a specific afternoon he remembered now with a disturbing clarity. She had said she needed to talk about something important, and he had postponed the conversation for 4 days. When they finally sat down, she had spoken of smaller things, a renovation in her office, a friend who was going through difficulties. He had concluded that the important subject had resolved itself. Now he wondered if she had simply given up on saying it. At 3 in the morning, Renato Cavalcanti got up, went to the kitchen, made a coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the counter looking at the apartment he had chosen alone, decorated by himself, where every detail reflected exclusively his taste. It was an efficient and well-resolved place, and it was, he realized with something like discomfort, deeply silent in a way that was not peace. It was Claudia who, without knowing what she was doing, provided the thread Renato needed. On a Wednesday morning, she mentioned in passing that she had seen Marina Caldas at an architecture and design exhibition at MASP about 4 months ago, before, therefore, the visit to the hospital. She said Marina was well, seemed excited, had talked to her for a few minutes. Claudia told this in a casual tone, like someone updating a file of general information about the world, without realizing she was reactivating something Renato had tried to keep inert. 4 months ago, Marina was at an exhibition at MASP, excited, talking to acquaintances, and in the following weeks she had ended up on a stretcher at São Joaquim in critical condition with a pregnancy he didn't know existed. The interval between these 2 moments was short and at the same time immense. He called Ricardo that same afternoon. This time, without trying to frame the call as a routine check, he went straight to the point. He said he had seen Marina at the hospital, that he knew she had been admitted, and that he wasn't calling to interfere in anything, just to know if she was out of risk. Ricardo was silent for a few seconds, and then said, with an economy of words that clearly came from a conscious effort, she was stable, that there had been a serious complication but the situation was under control, and that Marina had expressly requested that Renato not be contacted. This last sentence arrived with a specific weight, not with anger. Marina had not asked for him to be prevented from contacting her out of hostility or rancor. She had asked because she didn't want him to know, because she had made the decision to go through that without him, and she wanted that decision to be respected. Renato thanked Ricardo with the same precise courtesy he used in difficult professional situations and hung up. He stood with the phone in his hand for a moment, then went to the office window. Outside, the city continued with its usual indifference. Cars, buildings, the distant rumor of construction on the next block. He had built part of that urban landscape. He had decided, financed, and erected structures that other people inhabited. He was good at it. He knew how to evaluate land, how to calculate risks, how to identify the right moment to advance and to retreat. But faced with that, faced with a woman who had decided she didn't need him to go through the most vulnerable thing in her life, he had no repertoire. In the following days, he began to frequent the hospital in a way he himself would have classified as inappropriate if it was someone else doing it. He didn't go in. He stayed in the lobby or the outside area, checking the environment, trying to recognize faces that might be linked to Marina. It wasn't a strategy. It was the behavior of someone who doesn't know how to stay still in the face of something he cannot control. That was how he saw her for the second time. Not on the stretcher, not in critical condition. Marina was sitting in a wheelchair near the internal garden, accompanied by a nurse who had stepped away for a few minutes. She was looking at the garden with that expression he knew, concentrated inward, as if she were solving a silent calculation. She was pale, more so than usual. The belly, seen up close for the first time, was unmistakable. She was wearing hospital clothes but had put a beige cardigan over them, and he recognized the cardigan because he had been at her apartment when she bought it years ago, on a trip they took to the south. Marina looked up before he had decided whether to approach or not. For a moment, neither of them said anything. There was a whole series of things that could be said, and none of them seemed appropriate for a hospital garden in the early afternoon. It was she who spoke first. She said his name with a flatness that was neither cold nor warm, just the name, as if she were identifying him in a context she was still processing. He said he had passed by the hospital and that he needed to know if she was well. Immediately it sounded false, and he knew it sounded so, and she knew he knew. Marina was not a person who tolerated inaccuracies out of goodwill. She replied that she was fine, that she was being monitored, that there was a treatment plan underway. She said all this in a clinical and careful tone, like someone summarizing a situation for an interlocutor who has no emotional bond with the subject. He asked about the pregnancy. He asked directly because any roundabout way would be worse. Marina was silent for a moment, looking at him with that expression he had never been able to completely decipher, something between evaluation and exhaustion. Then she said that she had discovered the pregnancy a month after he left the apartment, that she had thought about calling him, that she had decided not to call. She didn't say why, not at that moment. She said only that she had made the decision and that it had been her decision. The nurse returned. Marina placed her hands in her lap with a gesture that closed the matter and looked again at the garden. Renato stood for a few more seconds, then said he would return. Marina did not respond, but she also didn't say not to return. And he clung to that in the undignified way people cling to the gaps that pain leaves. Isabella found out by chance, in the worst possible way, which is always how essential things are discovered when someone makes an effort not to tell them. She had arrived at the Cavalcanti Incorporações office without warning, which in itself was unusual. Renato had spent the last few days more distant than usual, responding to messages with delay, cancelling plans with justifications that sounded true, but that she had begun to verify involuntarily, like someone who starts checking if the door is locked twice after a scare. She had told herself she was being exaggerated, but she had gone to the office anyway. Claudia, who didn't know that Isabella didn't know anything, mentioned naturally that Dr. Cavalcanti was at São Joaquim, that he had left at 11 and usually stopped by there a few times a week in the last 2 weeks. Isabella was very quiet for a moment, thanked her with a smile that Claudia had no way of deciphering, and left. She arrived at the hospital before Renato. She stayed in the lobby waiting area with her phone in her hand, without looking at the screen. When he entered through the revolving door, he saw Isabella before reaching any other conclusion about the day. She was standing, and there was an expression on her face that he recognized immediately. It wasn't anger yet, it was the moment before anger, that brief instant of verification where the person is still deciding if what they are feeling is justified. He went to her. There was nothing to say that wasn't the truth, so he told the truth. Marina was hospitalized. He had discovered it by chance weeks ago. He had returned a few times to check how she was. He said he hadn't told Isabella because he didn't know how to explain it without it sounding bigger than it was, and that it had been a mistake not to tell her. Isabella heard everything with that immobility that precedes major decisions. Then she asked, with a calmness that visibly cost her something to maintain, if he still had feelings for Marina. He was silent for a moment that lasted too long. It wasn't a question he could answer easily, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was more complex than the question allowed. What he felt for Marina was not the love of the first years. It wasn't desire. It wasn't the kind of longing that asks for a return. It was something more like responsibility, a sense that he had failed her in specific ways he hadn't admitted to anyone, including himself, and that this failure didn't disappear just because the divorce papers had been signed. Isabella interpreted the silence in the only way that made sense to her. She said she needed a man who was truly present, that she had invested 8 months in a relationship that deserved more than postponed answers and unexplained absences. She said this without shouting, without dramatizing, with a dignity that he genuinely respected at the very moment the situation fell apart. She left the hospital before he could say anything else. Renato stood in the lobby for a few minutes, then went up to the floor where Marina was hospitalized. He had obtained authorization for visits through Ricardo, who had yielded after a long and difficult conversation 2 days before. Marina had been informed that he would visit and had responded neither yes nor no, which Ricardo had interpreted as an oblique form of consent. The room was small and bright, with a window that looked out over the back of the garden. Marina was leaning back in bed with a closed book on her lap, as if she had tried to read and given up. The belly, under the light sheet, made the environment more real than anything Renato had imagined in the previous weeks. He pulled the chair near the bed and sat down. Marina watched him without saying anything. He asked how she was feeling that day. She said better. She had undergone a cardiac stabilization procedure 2 days earlier, and the indices were responding well to the new protocol. She said this directly, without dramatizing and without minimizing, like someone who had learned to deal with medical information with the same objectivity one deals with any other category of data. Then he asked what he had wanted to ask since the garden, why she had decided not to tell him. Marina looked at the window for a moment. Then she turned her eyes back to him and said with a clarity that left no room for alternative interpretation, because she had discovered she was pregnant a week after he had said, in a conversation that lasted less than 40 minutes, that the marriage had exhausted its possibilities and that he needed something new. Because she had kept those words, something new, and had understood that it wasn't about the marriage, it was about her, that he had spent the last years looking at her and seeing something that had lost interest for him, and she was not willing to be kept out of obligation to see in the eyes of the father of her child that mixture of guilt and duty that replaces affection when affection goes away. She said she had preferred the difficulty of doing it alone to the poisoned ease of having him there out of obligation. Renato heard everything without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said with a difficulty that came not from resistance, but from a genuine lack of practice, that she was right about many things, that he had rewritten the marriage in a way that was convenient for him, that he had called her stability stagnation because it was easier than admitting the problem was in him, that he had reached a point where anything that wasn't new bored him, including the best things he had, and that he had only realized the size of what he had lost when he was in front of hospital doors that didn't open for him. She heard him. She didn't say everything was fine. She didn't say she forgave him. She sat looking at him with that expression of evaluation that he could now read better. She was deciding what to do with that, and there was no hurry. Outside, the city continued, and inside that bright room, something that had finally been said, after a long time being said only in silence, began to occupy the space that belonged to it. Marina's hospital discharge came 10 days later, conditioned on a rigorous outpatient follow-up protocol. Consultations every 2 weeks, restriction of physical effort, frequent cardiac monitoring. The condition she carried had been identified in the 2nd trimester of the pregnancy, an arrhythmia of structural origin that had remained asymptomatic for years and that the pregnancy had unexpectedly activated. The cardiologist had said that with the right care, the risk was manageable. Marina had listened to this with attention and had noted every instruction in a small notebook with the same meticulousness with which, years before, she documented design projects. She returned to the Higienopolis apartment with the help of her friend Fernanda, who had taken a few days of leave from work to accompany her in the first days at home. Ricardo was present too. He had reorganized the schedule of the company where he worked to have more flexibility in the following weeks. Marina had accepted their help without resisting, which for those who knew her was in itself a sign that she had learned, throughout all of that, to identify what she could carry alone and what she could not. Renato learned of the discharge from Ricardo in a short message that said only, "She went home today." He replied, "Thanks for letting me know." And he spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of diffuse attention that his team interpreted as exhaustion. But that was something else. The feeling of someone waiting for the next stage to define itself without having control over when that would happen. He had promised himself he would not show up without being called. This was a promise he had never needed to make before, because he had never been in a position where showing up without being called was relevant. His life had been structured so that people came to him, clients, partners, collaborators. Even Isabella had come to him first at a development launch event where she handled production. The idea of waiting, of placing himself in a position where another person determined the pace, was new and uncomfortable, but he waited. On the 5th day after Marina's discharge, he called Ricardo and asked if there was anything practical he could do. Not for Marina directly, he knew that path was closed for now, but for the apartment, for the structure, for anything that could be resolved without requiring Marina to receive something from him directly. Ricardo was silent for a moment. Then he said that the apartment had developed a problem in the electrical part of the kitchen that the building management had promised to resolve 6 weeks ago with no result, and that Marina had mentioned that the rocking chair she used in the bedroom had broken one of the armrests, and that she had tried to hire someone for repair, but the person had cancelled. Renato solved both problems in 2 days. He hired a trusted electrician who went directly to the apartment with the building's authorization. For the chair, he himself went to a carpentry shop in the neighborhood that had indicated projects for his office years ago and left the repair request with delivery instructions for when it was ready. He didn't go to the apartment. He didn't try to be present. He just solved things and asked Claudia to send a message to Ricardo confirming it was done. Marina found out from both, from the electrician who mentioned the name of the person who had hired him, and from Ricardo, who thought she should know. She heard the information without commenting. Fernanda, who was in the living room when Ricardo told her, stood looking at Marina, waiting for a reaction that didn't come immediately. Marina just picked up the glass of water that was on the side table and drank slowly, as if she needed a moment to organize something internal that had no ready form yet. That night, after Fernanda left, Marina sat in the bedroom armchair. The rocking chair had not yet returned from the carpentry shop, and looked at the ceiling for a while. She had spent the last few months building a fortress of autonomy, and she had built it well. The pregnancy, the consultations, the medical decisions, the adaptation of the apartment for what was ahead, she had handled everything with the same silent competence with which she always handled the things that mattered to her. It had been exhausting. It had been sometimes lonely in a way she hadn't admitted either to Fernanda or to Ricardo. And now there was this man, the same man who had said he needed something new, who had left the apartment with an efficiency that still made her grit her teeth when she remembered, solving electrical problems and sending chairs for repair without asking her to acknowledge it. She didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't forgiveness, and it was too early, and there was a lot that hadn't been said yet. It wasn't indifference. She had stopped being indifferent to him the moment she saw him standing in the hospital corridor, looking at her as if the ground had disappeared. It was something in the middle, without a name yet, that she was letting exist without trying to classify. The following week, she sent a message to him. Just one line. The chair arrived. It's good. Thank you. He read the message 3 times before responding with a simple period. I'm glad. And he stood looking at those 2 words for a long time, thinking that there was a huge difference between solving problems and being present, and that for the first time in a long time, he was learning the difference in practice without a manual. The following 2 months were a series of small gestures that Renato learned to make without expectation of immediate return, which, he had discovered, was the hardest part. He was used to his acts producing measurable results. That was how the world he had built worked. Decision, action, result. The return could be slow, but there was always a metric, a deadline, a way to evaluate if the investment had been worth it. With Marina, there was no metric. There was only what he did and the silence that came after, and he had to learn to live with that silence without interpreting it as failure. He began to anonymously pay for the medical expenses that her health plan did not cover. There was a specialized consultation every 15 days with a fetal cardiologist who worked in a private clinic near Ibirapuera, and the amount was significant. Ricardo had mentioned this in a conversation and had been silent afterward, as if he didn't quite know what he had meant to say with that. Renato had understood. He made the arrangement through an intermediary so that the payment arrived as an anonymous credit in the clinic system. Marina found out that someone had paid. The receptionist had said there was a benefit applied to the account, but she didn't know immediately who. There was another change that he hadn't planned, but that happened gradually. He began to review some of the projects he had accepted in the last 2 years. There was a partnership with a development group from the interior that involved buying land in a preservation area, with reports that he knew were technically legitimate, but ethically doubtful. He had ignored this discomfort for a while because the numbers were good, and because there was a part of him that had learned to isolate what was inconvenient for the efficient functioning of the company. After everything that had happened, After discovering how many things he had isolated for convenience, not only in business but in everything, he had renegotiated the terms of the partnership. The partner had complained. Renato had said it was that or an exit, and it was an exit. Claudia had asked, with the caution of someone asking knowing they might not want the full answer if he was well. He had said he was, and it was true. In the same way it is true that a fracture in the process of healing is well, functional, present, changing shape while it heals. At the end of the 7th month of Marina's pregnancy, she invited him to a consultation. Not by phone, through Ricardo, who had become the informal channel between the two, a kind of involuntary diplomat who performed the role with a mixture of loyalty to his sister and something that, in conversations with Marina herself, she had identified as cautious hope. The invitation was specific, a routine consultation with the fetal cardiologist, where the protocols for the birth would be reviewed. She had told Ricardo she wanted him to know what was being planned. No more than that. Renato went. He arrived before the scheduled time, stayed in the clinic's waiting room without checking his phone, which for him was an almost physical effort. Marina arrived accompanied by Fernanda, who greeted Renato with a reserved politeness. She had been Marina's friend throughout the marriage and knew things he would probably never know. There was a silent judgment in her posture that he did not try to contest. The consultation was technical and long. The doctor explained the procedures planned for the birth. There was a specific protocol for Marina's cardiac condition, which included continuous monitoring and a standby team. The probability of complications had consistently decreased over the weeks with treatment, and the specialist had said the prognosis was positive as long as the protocol was followed to the letter. Renato heard everything, asked a technical question about the monitoring procedure that the doctor answered with professional approval, and remained silent for the rest of the consultation. When they left, Marina stood on the sidewalk while Fernanda went to get the car. The afternoon sun in Jardins hit from the side, giving the asphalt that end-of-day glow that São Paulo had sometimes unexpectedly beautiful. Marina said, without looking at him directly, that she had discovered it had been him paying for the consultations at the clinic. The receptionist had made a slip in an email exchange with the insurance plan. She wasn't angry. She was telling him because she thought he deserved to know that she knew. He said yes, it had been him, and that it hadn't been to obtain anything, that it was simply what he could do that was real and concrete and didn't depend on her accepting anything. Marina was silent for a moment. Then she said something he didn't expect, that the biggest problem of the marriage had never been a lack of love. There was love, for a long time. The problem had been that he had never learned to be truly present, that his way of caring always passed through control, through efficiency, through measurable results. And that only now, seeing him do things without guarantees, could she recognize that he had learned something that the entire marriage had not managed to teach. It wasn't a forgiveness, she didn't say that. But there was something in that sentence that was different from everything that had been said before. It was an honest evaluation, without resentment and without condescension, from someone who had decided to look at things as they were. Fernanda's car stopped at the curb. Marina left with her, and Renato stood on the sidewalk of Jardins looking at the space where she had been, with Gu phrase still in the air, thinking that it had taken him 52 years to learn that real presence has no guaranteed return, and that this, paradoxically, was the only type that was worth anything. Marina's daughter was born on an August afternoon, 3 weeks before the scheduled date. It wasn't an emergency, it was an anticipated medical decision, based on cardiac indicators that had shown a slight fluctuation in the previous days. The cardiologist had opted for anticipation as a precautionary measure, and Marina had agreed with a calm that came from entire months, learning to trust the protocol without trying to control every detail of it. Ricardo had called Renato when the procedure began. He hadn't asked him to go to the hospital. He had just informed him, as he had done at other times, with that economy of judgment that characterized the relationship the two had built throughout all of that. Renato went. He stayed in the waiting room of the obstetrics floor, which was different from the waiting rooms he knew. There was a different noise, a quality of tension that wasn't exactly tension, more like compressed anticipation. There were other people waiting too, and he sat among them without distinguishing himself in any way, which was unusual for him and which that afternoon seemed completely appropriate. The girl was born at 4:42 in the afternoon. Ricardo came to let him know. He said Marina was fine, that the baby was fine, that the indices were good. He said all this at once, quickly, like someone distributing relief before the other's body needs to ask. Renato nodded. He was silent for a moment and then said with a voice he himself didn't completely recognize that he was thankful. Not just for the information, for everything, for Ricardo's willingness to be the intermediary for months, for not having cut contact when he would have had reason to do so, for having given Renato some way of not being completely excluded from something that, whatever his legal situation, had become the most important thing in his life. Ricardo looked at him for a moment. Then he placed his hand on his shoulder briefly, the gesture of someone who has no words that are sufficient, but understands that silence is also not enough. Then he went back inside. Renato stayed in the waiting room for another hour. He didn't wait to be called. He had understood that he would not be called that day, and that it was fine that way. When he left the hospital, the city had that August late afternoon light that São Paulo rarely had. Clean, almost cold, with a quality of beginning that contradicts the season. He walked to the car slowly without haste and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before starting the engine. There was a girl in the world who was Marina's daughter, who was in some way that papers did not determine but biology and history did, also his. And Marina had gone through all of that, the pregnancy, the cardiac condition, the weeks of hospitalization, the months of protocol, the early birth, with a silent determination that he had called pride for a long time, but that he now recognized by the correct name, dignity, the refusal to be reduced to an object of pity or obligation, to receive a presence that was not genuine. She had preferred real difficulty to false ease, and that was not weakness. It was the most courageous thing he had witnessed in his life. In the following months, Renato reorganized his life with the same meticulousness with which he had always conducted his business, but with a different purpose. He sold his stake in one of the secondary developments, a project that existed more as a symbol of expansion than as a real necessity, reduced the load of social commitments he had accumulated by habit, and reallocated time for things he had postponed indefinitely. He resumed contact with a college friend he had lost over the years of professional rise. He began attending a watercolor course on Tuesdays, not because he had a particular aptitude, he had quickly discovered he didn't, but because there was something in the process of doing something, without a guarantee of result, that he needed to practice in a concrete way. Marina had authorized 6 weeks after the birth a formal visit. Not at the apartment, on an afternoon at a cafe in Higienópolis, with Fernanda present. Renato had arrived punctual, as always, but there was something different about the punctuality of that afternoon. It was no longer the punctuality of someone who controls the pace, but that of someone who respects the agreement without demanding that it mean more than it means. The girl was named Clara. Marina had chosen the name without consulting anyone, which he had learned from Ricardo, and he had found it appropriate, not for the choice itself, but for the fact that she had exercised that choice with total freedom. Clara had dark eyes and a way of wrinkling her forehead when there was noise that Marina had said with a small smile was familiar. He had held the girl for a few minutes, with a caution that was not typical of him, but that he had learned in recent months not to disguise. He had been silent during almost all of that time, looking at that face that was still discovering the world with the specific seriousness of newcomers. When he handed Clara back to Marina and said he needed to go, Marina looked at him for a moment and then said he could return the following week if he wanted. It was a short sentence without adornments. It wasn't a reconciliation, it wasn't a declaration, it wasn't a promise of anything that didn't yet exist. It was an opening, of the specific type that is only given when one trusts, not in certainties, but in the direction a person has demonstrated they have taken. He said he would return, and he left the cafe with that opening still in the air, aware that what lay ahead would not be easy or guaranteed, but that he had learned, finally too late for some things and in time for others, that the only way to be worthy of a presence is first to learn to be present without demanding that it be rewarded. Outside, Higienopolis had that silence of an old neighborhood in the late afternoon. Large trees, wide sidewalks, light coming in from the side between the buildings. Renato walked an entire block without thinking about a schedule or results. He just walked, with that specific weight of someone carrying something important and knowing they will continue carrying it, and that this now is not a burden, is not a... 6 months later, Clara already recognized voices. There was a specific way she stopped what she was doing, usually examining her own wrist, with a concentration that Marina found at once comical and touching, when she heard certain familiar sounds. Marina's voice, of course, Fernanda's, Ricardo's, who had become a kind of constant presence on weekends, and, after a few weeks, Renato's voice, which arrived on Tuesdays at 5 in the afternoon and stayed for exactly the time Marina had agreed upon, an hour and a half, depending on how the day had gone for both of them. There was no romanticism in that arrangement, at least not the kind that is declared. There was something harder and more real, two adults who had hurt each other in different ways, learning to coexist around something that was larger than what had separated them. Marina had resumed her design consultancy work 2 months after the birth, 3 hours a day at first, with an old client who had waited patiently. There was a new project on the horizon, the curation of environments for a boutique hotel in Consolação, that left her with a specific lightness that Fernanda had noticed and commented on one afternoon over coffee. Renato had said on one of the Tuesdays that he was thinking of reducing the developer's project portfolio even further. Not out of exhaustion, he had made clear, but because he had realized he had built too many things by accumulation and too few by choice, that there was a difference between growing and just continuing to expand, because stopping would seem like defeat. Marina had listened to that in silence and then said, almost to herself, that it was a distinction that took time to learn. He had agreed without expanding on the subject, and there was something in that moment, in that shared brevity, that was more intimate than many long conversations they had had in the past. Clara slept in the next room with that serene rhythm that newcomers have before discovering anxiety. There were things that were still not resolved. The relationship between Renato and Marina did not have a name that fit easily into a sentence. They were no longer married, they weren't exactly friends, they weren't just co-responsible for a child. They were two people who were, with care and without haste, rebuilding trust from the foundations. It was slow, it was sometimes uncomfortable. There were difficult conversations that still needed to happen, and both knew that. But there were also those Tuesdays. There was Clara recognizing voices. There was Marina with a new project on the horizon, and Renato learning watercolor on Tuesdays, which he had mentioned one afternoon, and Marina had laughed, genuinely, for the first time in a long time in his presence. It was a small laugh, but it was real, and he had kept it with a care he had never dispensed to any financial asset. Redemption, he had discovered, was not an event. It was a Tuesday at 5 in the afternoon. It was a chair sent for repair. It was an hour and a half without an agenda. It was learning, at 52 years old, that presence cannot be delegated, and that the people who are worth it are the ones who stay when control goes away. It is possible that this story resonates with you in some way, because we have all been, at some point, in the place of someone who left too early, or someone who was left waiting to be truly seen. If you have made it this far, it means that something in this narrative touched something that is yours. If you want to continue being touched by stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Every week we bring a new narrative that honestly explores the complexities of life, love, and the choices that form us. Leave a like if this story stayed with you, and tell us in the comments, which character did you recognize yourself in most? The answer might surprise you. We wait for you here. End of story.